The gate didn't open with light or sound. It didn't announce itself. It didn't ask for your attention. It closed. Not with a slam, not with finality, but with the soft certainty of something finishing its work. And you felt it not as an event, but as an after-feeling. A quiet shift that didn't belong to any headline or calendar. The days around the solstice passed like any other. Streets still glowed. Messages still arrived. The world performed its routines flawlessly. Yet somewhere beneath that surface continuity, something subtle withdrew. And in the space it left behind, a strange awareness began to surface. You might have noticed it first in your body. A pressure that didn't hurt, but insisted on being felt. A faint tightness in the chest that wasn't anxiety, yet wasn't calm either. Sleep that came, but didn't fully restore. Thoughts that arrived uninvited, not loud enough to alarm you, not clear enough to resolve. It wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't stress, and it didn't feel like fear. It felt like standing in a familiar room after the furniture has been moved in the dark. Everything is technically still there, but your sense of where things should be no longer applies. You may have brushed it off. Most people do. There's always an explanation, ready end of via fatigue, disrupted schedules, too much screen time. But explanations don't usually linger in the body. They don't create that low, persistent hum beneath awareness. This did. The Hopi speak of moments like this not as beginnings, but as closures. They never described the passage between worlds as a dramatic crossing. No collapse, no trumpet blast, no line in the sand. Instead, they warned of something far quieter and far more disorienting. A door that closes without asking if you're ready. After it happens, nothing looks immediately different. But the way you relate to what you see begins to change. The familiar loses its grip. The predictable stops feeling reliable. And the mind, trained to search for causes outside itself, comes up empty. Because this kind of shift doesn't arrive from the world. It arrives through you. You may have noticed a faint sense of distance from things that once felt automatic. Conversations that drift without anchoring. Activities you used to reach for without thinking now feel oddly hollow. Even moments of joy land differently, not weaker, just altered. As if the background frequency has changed, and everything else is trying to catch up. There's a temptation, at times like this, to look outward for confirmation. To ask whether something happened, to scan news feeds, timelines, skies. But the Hopi taught that the most important transitions are invisible to the eyes. They unfold internally first, because consciousness is always the last structure to update. When a world ends, it doesn't vanish. It stops responding. You might feel that now in subtle frustrations. Systems that once made sense suddenly feel brittle. Explanations that once soothed now feel thin. You don't necessarily reject them, you just stop leaning on them. And that withdrawal creates a vacuum. Silence rushes in. Not peaceful silence, attentive silence. The kind that listens. This is why the closing of the gate doesn't feel like loss at first. It feels like absence. A missing signal you didn't realize you were depending on. And without it, your inner orientation begins to wobble. The Hopi warned that during such passages, people would feel unmoored, not because they are lost, but because the reference points they were using no longer align. Imagine a compass that still functions perfectly, but north has shifted a few degrees overnight. The needle hasn't broken. The map hasn't changed, but following it the same way will slowly lead you astray. So the body reacts before the mind can catch up. Restlessness without a story. Emotion without a clear source. A sense of waiting without knowing for what. This is not the feeling of something beginning. It is the sensation of something finishing its hold. The solstice, in this understanding, is not a switch. It's a seal. The visible moment passes, and the real work begins afterward, quietly, slowly, beneath awareness. The Hopi never focused on the day itself. They watched the days that followed. They listened for the residue, the ghost of the solstice, because what matters isn't the turning of the sun. It's what the turning loosens inside you. When the external light begins its return, something internal is invited to recalibrate, and recalibration is rarely comfortable. Systems don't like admitting their settings are outdated. You might notice heightened sensitivity now. Sounds feel sharper. Crowds feel heavier. Even your own thoughts feel louder than usual, as if the volume has been turned up without your consent. This isn't overload, it's reception. An increase in signal that arrives before you've learned how to filter it. The Hopi described this phase as a narrowing, not of possibilities, but of tolerance. The margin for noise shrinks. What once blended into the background begins to stand out. And standing out is unsettling because it demands attention. This is why the gate doesn't announce itself. If it did, the mind would rush to interpret, categorize, control. Instead, it closes quietly and waits for you to notice what no longer works. You may feel an urge to slow down without knowing why, or the opposite, a restless compulsion to keep moving, to avoid sitting with the unfamiliar stillness. Both responses come from the same place, a nervous system sensing that the old rhythm is no longer reliable. And here is the most important thing to understand, though it may not feel comforting yet. Nothing has gone wrong. What you are sensing is not a breakdown. It is the friction that occurs when an internal calibration no longer matches the environment it evolved to navigate. The world you learned to move through, the one governed by predictable feedback, linear progression, and delayed consequences, has begun to loosen its grip. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough for you to feel it. The Hopi never said everyone would notice the gate closing. They said some would feel it immediately, others only after confusion sets in, and many not at all. Awareness, in their tradition, was never distributed evenly. It arrives where there is readiness or necessity. If you're listening now, it's because something in you has already begun to adjust. This first sign is not dramatic. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't ask for action. It simply presents a question through sensation. What if the world you were calibrated for has quietly finished, and something else has begun asking for your attention? You don't need to answer it yet. You only need to notice how the question feels in your body. Because the gate has already closed, and the silence it left behind is not empty. It's preparatory. What you are feeling did not begin with you, and it did not arrive suddenly. Long before calendars were printed or moments were divided into seconds, the Hopi watched for thresholds, not events. Thresholds, places where one state quietly gives way to another without spectacle. They understood that the most consequential changes do not announce themselves to the senses trained for disruption. They announce themselves to the body. This is why the solstice, in Hopi understanding, was never treated as a single night to be observed and forgotten. It was approached as a passager, thinning of boundaries, a point where the world becomes briefly permeable, and what follows matters more than what occurs at the center. You may have been taught that the solstice is a moment when the sun pauses and reverses course. Technically, that is true, but the Hopi were never interested in technicalities. They paid attention to what lingered afterward, to what seeped in once the visible marker had passed. They warned that certain alignments do not release their influence all at once. They leave behind a residue, an energetic echo that continues to move through people long after the sky appears unchanged. This is why the days following the solstice can feel heavier than the day itself. Not darker, just denser. As if something unseen is pressing gently against the inside of your awareness. They called this phase a listening period. Not because something external is speaking loudly, but because the internal noise begins to fall away enough for subtler signals to be detected, and detection, at first, feels like discomfort. The nervous system notices change before it understands meaning. This is where the concept of KV enters not as metaphor, but as function. The Hopi described a point at the crown of the head as a passageway, an opening through which human consciousness communicates with larger orders of reality. It was not treated as symbolic language. It was described operationally, like an interface. During periods of stability, this opening remains quiet, dormant, not closed, just inactive. But during transitions, especially those involving cosmic rhythm, it becomes sensitive, receptive, almost antenna-like. If you've noticed pressure at the top of your head, moments of light dizziness, sudden emotional vulnerability without cause, or a sense that your thoughts are arriving faster than you can organize them, you are not malfunctioning. You are receiving. The difficulty is that modern life has trained you to treat reception as overload. Information is something to be filtered, muted, controlled. But this is not informational noise. It doesn't arrive as data. It arrives as sensation. And sensation resists categorization. The Hopi understood that when Kapavi becomes active, the body experiences an increase in internal signal. Sensitivity heightens. Emotional thresholds lower. Sleep fragments. Thoughts surface uninvited. This is not because something is wrong. It is because the internal environment is adjusting to a new tempo. You are not being given more to do. You are being given more to feel. And feeling, for a system accustomed to constant distraction, can be destabilizing. When attention is no longer consumed externally, it turns inward. That inward turn is often mistaken for anxiety. But anxiety has a narrative. This does not. It arrives without explanation and lingers without resolution. Modern science, without realizing it, brushes against the edges of this ancient understanding. The human nervous system evolved within stable environmental rhythms, light, darkness, magnetism. Subtle shifts in those rhythms don't register as conscious alarms, but they do affect perception, mood, and internal timing. You may notice that your emotional responses feel closer to the surface now, not bigger closer, as if there is less distance between what you feel and what you notice yourself feeling. This proximity can be uncomfortable. The buffer zones are thinning. The Hopi never framed this as awakening in the way modern language does. They didn't speak of ascension or enlightenment. They spoke of alignment. Of the body learning to stand in a different current without resisting it. Resistance, they warned, creates friction. This is why some people experience the post-solstice period as agitation, restlessness, irritation with small things, a desire to escape, to numb, to drown out the subtle signals returning to awareness. The old strategies still function, but they feel less effective, less satisfying, because they were designed for a different world. The fourth world, as the Hopi described it, rewarded distraction. Survival required adaptation to artificial rhythms, schedules, hierarchies, systems that valued speed over presence. In that world, sensitivity was a liability. Numbness was protection. But the fifth world operates on a different principle. Sensitivity becomes information. Discomfort becomes guidance. And numbness, instead of protecting, begins to obstruct. This does not mean everyone transitions at the same pace. It does not mean you are ahead or behind. The Hopi never framed this passage competitively. They knew that different people would attune differently. Some would feel the shift immediately. Others would only recognize it after the old structures failed them completely. What matters is not when you notice, but how you respond once you do. You may feel an urge now to seek explanation, to name what is happening, to fit it into a framework that makes it manageable. That urge is natural. The mind reaches for structure when the familiar dissolves. But this phase does not ask for understanding yet. It asks for tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for sensation without story. Tolerance for not knowing what exactly has changed, only that something has. The Hopi warned that this was the most delicate moment of the passage, not because it was dangerous, but because misinterpretation could harden into resistance. When people label recalibration as threat, they tighten against it, and tightening creates pain. Those who allow the process, who listen without demanding immediate clarity of them, experience something else after the discomfort settles. A strange clarity, not answers, but orientation. A sense that while the external world feels unstable, something internal is quietly reorganizing itself. This is why the solstice residue does not overwhelm. It introduces, slowly, patiently, like water finding its way through stone. You are not expected to do anything with this yet. You are only being asked to notice that your inner environment is more responsive than it used to be. And responsiveness is not weakness. It is sensitivity returning to a system that learned to survive without it. The threshold the ancients watched is not behind you. It is still unfolding. And as it does, it begins to alter something even more fundamental than emotion or thought. It begins to loosen your relationship with time itself. Time is still moving. Clocks haven't stopped. Calendars still flip when they're supposed to. And yet, something about time no longer behaves the way it used to. You may have noticed it in small, almost forgettable ways. A single afternoon that stretches endlessly, heavy and resistant, every task requiring effort far beyond its weight. Then, without warning, an entire week disappears. You struggle to remember where it went, what filled it, how it passed so quickly. You sit down to do something simple. You glance away for what feels like a moment. Hours are gone. Or the opposite happens. Minutes crawl thick and slow, as if reality itself is moving through molasses. This isn't distraction, and it isn't imagination. The Hopi described this sensation as the first unmistakable sign that a passage between worlds has begun. Not because time itself changes, but because your relationship to it does. In the fourth world, time was external. It ruled from the outside in. Measured, divided, enforced. Hours dictated worth. Schedules defined success. Life moved forward in straight lines, and deviation was punished with anxiety. Time was something you moved through. But the fifth world, according to Hopi understanding, is governed by something else entirely. Not hours, not minutes. Rhythm, and rhythm behaves very differently. To understand why time feels unstable now, it helps to consider the planet itself, not as a place, but as a system with a pulse. Modern science refers to this pulse as the Schumann resonance, a set of electromagnetic frequencies generated by lightning striking the space between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. Often called the heartbeat of the Earth, this resonance has historically remained relatively stable. Human biology evolved within that consistency. Brainwaves, sleep cycles, hormonal rhythms, even perception of duration unconsciously synchronized to it. When the pulse was steady, time felt predictable, linear, manageable. But when rhythm shifts, perception follows. In recent years, observers have noted irregularity spikes, pauses, moments where the rhythm accelerates and then falls strangely silent. Science debates causes. Data points are measured, analyzed, argued over. But the Hopi interpretation is far older and far simpler. When the drummer changes pace, the dancers feel it first. You may notice this change in how memory behaves. Recent events feel oddly distant, as if they happened longer ago than they did. Meanwhile, moments from years past surface with vivid clarity, sensory, emotional, alive. It's not nostalgia, it's reorganization. The fourth world trained memory to support progress. The fifth world begins to reorganize memory around relevance. This is why the days of the week begin to blur. Not because you're careless, but because the distinctions suddenly feel arbitrary. The body no longer treats Monday and Saturday as fundamentally different experiences. The rigid compartments of time begin to soften. You might also notice a loss of urgency around long-term planning. Goals that once felt compelling now feel abstract. Not unimportant, just distant. Meanwhile, the present moment grows heavier, more demanding of attention. This is not procrastination, it is recalibration. The Hopi described the fourth world as the world of straight lines. Progress moved forward relentlessly. Time marched on, indifferent to awareness. The fifth world, by contrast, is circular. Time loops, folds, responds to attention. In this world, moments expand when they are inhabited fully. They contract when they are resisted. Presence stretches time. Distraction collapses it. This is why two people can live the same day and experience entirely different lengths of time. One feels rushed, pressured, overwhelmed. The other feels strangely spacious, even calm. The difference is not circumstance, it is alignment. Those who cling tightly to schedules, deadlines, and rigid routines often feel the most anxiety during this phase. The mind attempts to force linear order onto a reality that is no longer cooperating. When it fails, tension builds. Meanwhile, those who allow flexibility, who listen rather than command, begin to experience moments of profound stillness. Not because chaos has disappeared, but because they are no longer fighting the rhythm beneath it. This is not escapism, it is adaptation. The sensation that time is speeding up is only half the truth. Time is becoming less uniform. It stretches where awareness deepens. It compresses where attention fractures. The old guarantee that each hour would feel roughly the same begins to dissolve. And this dissolution serves a purpose. In a world governed by rhythm rather than clocks, presence becomes power. Decisions made unconsciously carry immediate weight. Moments ignored pass without return. The distortion of time forces a choice: remain synchronized with artificial systems, or begin listening to the subtler tempo underneath them. This is why the experience feels personal, intimate, almost intrusive. You are not losing time. You are being asked how you wish to inhabit it. The Hopi elders warned that during the transition between worlds, humanity would lose its shared sense of time. Some would chase the past, desperate to restore familiar structures. Others would anchor themselves in the present, learning to move with what is emerging. The division would not be political, not geographic, but perceptual, and perceptual divisions are harder to see until they aren't. You may notice impatience rising when others insist on rushing, or discomfort when conversations revolve entirely around future anxieties or past grievances. Time, in those moments, feels distorted again, not because it is unstable, but because you are being pulled out of rhythm. The fifth world does not eliminate planning, it reframes it. The future no longer dominates the present. It becomes responsive to it. This can feel unsettling. The fourth world equated control with safety. When predictability loosens, the nervous system interprets it as danger. But the Hopi understood that true instability does not come from change, it comes from clinging to patterns that no longer match reality. Time has not betrayed you. It has stopped pretending, and when the illusion of uniform time fades, another change follows naturally. One that is far more uncomfortable than lost schedules or blurred weeks. Because when rhythm replaces measurement, falsehood becomes impossible to tolerate. And that discomfort marks the second sign. At first, it doesn't announce itself clearly. It arrives as irritation, a subtle tightening in the stomach during conversations that once felt normal. A quiet resistance when you scroll past headlines that used to hold your attention. A sense of fatigue that doesn't come from doing too much, but from engaging with things that no longer feel honest. You might tell yourself you're just tired, or distracted, or becoming impatient. But impatience usually wants something to change. This feeling wants something to stop. The Hopi described this phase not as awakening, but as unmasking. In their tradition, the Kashina are beings who move between worlds, appearing in ceremony wearing elaborate masks. These masks were not lies. They served a purpose. They allowed transition. They made the unfamiliar approachable. But there is a lesser-known teaching that accompanies these rituals. There comes a time when the masks must be removed, not as punishment, as necessity. When the internal rhythm shifts, the nervous system loses tolerance for distortion. What once passed unnoticed now feels abrasive. False enthusiasm, performative kindness, recycled narratives repeated without conviction. They no longer glide past awareness. They collide with it. You feel this collision physically. A tightening in the chest when someone speaks words they don't mean. A wave of nausea when watching news framed to provoke rather than inform. Pressure behind the eyes during conversations that circle endlessly without substance. These reactions are not moral judgments. They are biological feedback. The body knows before the mind is willing to admit it. In the fourth world, survival often depended on adaptation to artificial structures. People learned to smile when they disagreed, to stay silent when something felt wrong, to accept narratives that contradicted lived experience. Conformity was rewarded. Dissonance was suppressed. That world required masks. But the fifth world does not negotiate with falsehood. It exposes it. And exposure is uncomfortable. This is why relationships begin to shift during this phase. Not only romantic ones, friendships, family dynamics, professional alliances. You may find yourself unable to maintain conversations centered on status, fear, or superficial outrage. Small talk begins to feel exhausting. Performative concern feels hollow. It is not that others have changed overnight. It is that you can no longer look away. The Hopi warned that during the passage between worlds, the greatest shock would not come from the sky, but from within the home. Truth would surface in familiar spaces, workplaces, communities, families. The unmasking would not be dramatic. It would be relentless. What collapses during this phase is not structure, it is pretense. For many, this creates fear. The fourth world trained humanity to equate stability with sameness. When old agreements dissolve, the nervous system interprets it as danger. This is why some people double down on denial, distraction, or aggression. The frequency gap feels intolerable. But there is another response. Some begin to experience a strange relief. Conversations become fewer, but more meaningful. Solitude feels nourishing rather than lonely. There is less tolerance for noise, but more capacity for depth. This is not isolation. It is clarification. The allergy to falsehood does not mean superiority. It does not mean you are more aware than others. It simply means your system can no longer digest what lacks authenticity. Just as the body rejects spoiled food, consciousness rejects distorted information. And this rejection does not stop with others. You may begin to notice it in yourself. Old habits that once felt harmless now feel heavy. Words spoken out of obligation leave a residue. Agreements made automatically begin to feel expensive. You catch yourself before saying yes, before laughing along, before pretending. This self-recognition can be unsettling. The masks we wear for others are often the same ones we wear internally. When they begin to slip, there is a brief moment of disorientation. Who are you without the performance? Without the reflexive roles? The Hopi elders taught that this phase was necessary because the fifth world cannot be built on borrowed identities. Masks may serve a purpose during transition, but they cannot survive arrival. The unmasking is not a demand for perfection. It is a demand for coherence. And coherence leaves no room for sustained deception, external or internal. What remains after the unmasking may feel smaller at first. Fewer connections, fewer distractions, fewer identities to hide behind. But what remains is real. And once the noise falls away, another capacity begins to emerge. One that is far more powerful and far more dangerous. Because in a world without distortion, intention no longer lingers in delay. It manifests. That realization ushers in the third and final sign. In the fourth world, there was always distance. Distance between what you thought and what happened. Between what you felt and what changed. You could hold an intention for years without consequence. You could repeat the same fears endlessly, let the same doubts loop quietly in the background, and the world would absorb them without immediate response. That distance acted as a buffer. It softened impact. It delayed consequence. The Hopi understood this delay as a kind of insulation. Reality was dense. Systems were slow. Structures absorbed intention before it could take shape. Cause and effect were separated by time, explanation, bureaucracy, and distraction. The fifth world removes that insulation. Not abruptly, but unmistakably. You may have noticed it already. A thought held casually seems to ripple outward faster than expected. An emotional state lingers for a day and suddenly finds reflection in circumstances. Decisions that once took months to show results now return feedback almost immediately, sometimes within hours. This can feel exhilarating or terrifying, often both. The space between intention and outcome is shrinking, not because the world is becoming magical, but because it is becoming responsive. The Hopi never spoke of manifestation as a technique. There were no rituals for attracting outcomes. They spoke of responsibility. They warned that during the transition into the fifth world, humans would rediscover a capacity they had forgotten, not because it was mystical, but because it was dangerous when mishandled. Consciousness, they taught, is a shaping force. Modern physics circles this idea without fully naming it. The observer effect suggests that observation itself alters behavior at the smallest measurable scales. Reality does not fully resolve until it is perceived. Possibility collapses into form through attention. In the fourth world, this effect was muted by density. Intentions diffused before they could crystallize. In the fifth world, density decreases. Responsiveness increases. Reality becomes less resistant. This is why manifestation now feels immediate. A casual fear spirals into conflict within days. A clear decision opens unexpected paths almost instantly. Emotional patterns that once took years to surface now demand confrontation quickly, efficiently, without mercy. This speed is not a reward. It is a responsibility. The fifth world does not tolerate unconscious creation. What you hold internally, especially what you repeat, no longer remains private. It imprints. It echoes, and it returns amplified. This is why some people feel overwhelmed. The mind trained in the fourth world was allowed to wander. Fear-based scenarios could play endlessly without consequence. Self-criticism became background noise. In the fifth world, those patterns behave differently. They externalize. And when they do, it can feel as though the world itself has become harsher, more reactive, less forgiving. But the truth is subtler. Reality has not changed its temperament. It has changed its response time. Those who remain unaware experience this as chaos. Life begins to feel unstable, unpredictable, even hostile. But those who recognize the pattern sense something else entirely: precision. What unfolds now follows coherence, not desire. Intentions rooted in clarity, presence, and grounded awareness tend to move smoothly. Those rooted in fear, scarcity, or reaction unfold just as efficiently, but with consequences that arrive faster than expected. This does not mean suppressing emotion or forcing optimism. The fifth world does not reward denial. It rewards alignment. Feeling is allowed. Reaction is allowed. What changes is how long those states are permitted to linger unexamined. Thought must now be treated as action. Emotion as architecture. Attention as currency. This is why many people feel called to slow down. Not because time demands it, but because awareness does. There is less margin for impulsive thinking, less tolerance for self-deception, less forgiveness for ignoring what you already sense. The fifth world does not punish mistakes. It mirrors them, immediately, and mirrors are uncomfortable. Yet within this danger lies a profound opportunity. For the first time in generations, human beings are being asked to participate consciously in creation, not as controllers, but as stewards. To notice the quality of their thoughts. To feel emotions without letting them harden into identity. To choose intention carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for consequence. The Hopi never described this era as utopian. They described it as revealing. Those who cultivate inner stillness find that life begins to organize itself with surprising efficiency. Less drama, fewer detours. Needs are met without excess. Those who chase control or power find reality reflecting instability back at them with equal force. This is the dividing line. Not between good and bad. Not between awakened and asleep. But between coherence and noise. And here, at the end of this passage, comes the quiet realization that changes everything. The fifth world is not waiting in the future. It is already here. Not as a destination beyond catastrophe or salvation, but as a shift in perception. It emerges the moment the world you once understood stops responding the same way. When effort yields different results. When distraction no longer protects. When intention carries weight. If you feel disoriented, fatigued, or strangely exposed, you are not failing this transition. You are inside it. The loss of old certainties is not punishment, it is preparation. Structures are loosening so awareness can take their place. What feels like chaos on the surface is, beneath it, a deep reordering. The Hopi elders left a reminder for this moment. We are the ones we have been waiting for. Not leaders, not systems, not saviors. The responsibility was always internal. The noise outside will continue. The world will still move, quickly, loudly, unpredictably. But a new stillness is taking root within those willing to listen. Trust the intuition sharpening inside you. Trust the discomfort it is teaching discernment. And trust that this unfamiliar rhythm is not exile. It is home. Let the thoughts settle. Let the body adjust. There is nothing you need to rush toward. The world has already begun to respond.